So we have Peter Warren in the plane today.
Right.
Peter, you're our first international guest.
Am I?
Yes. And
That's thrilling.
Peter's from Australia.
I live in London now, though.
You live in London,
Yeah.
and you used to be in the Australian Navy. You were a naval officer.
That is correct.
And part of your duties were to map ocean floors.
That's right, yep.
And because of that, when Malaysian airline 370 went down, one of aviation's greatest mysteries of all time.
Maybe the greatest, yeah.
You were called in as part of the team to lead the search to find that plane. This plane departed from Kuala Lumpur. It was headed to Beijing.
Yeah, about 40 minutes into the flight, they say goodbye and good night to the Malaysian traffic control, and they're supposed to just a few minutes later pick up with the Vietnamese air traffic control, and they never did. Yeah.
So initially the pilot turns off, or somebody turns off the radios, the transponder goes black, and then at some point later, something goes back on.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And what went back on?
Well, it was a system that communicates, it's the engines communicating with a satellite. And so what we had then is a series of these handshakes, which we were able to use to get a range measurement from the satellite. And so what that then does is draw a big circle over the Earth's surface, what we might call an arc. Sort of based on that, you can tell exactly, well, you get a sense of where the plane went south. In terms of,
now this was supposed to be a 5-hour flight.
Yeah, approximately, yeah.
They go dark after the first hour.
Yeah.
But because of this handshake system that you described, we know that he actually flew for another 7 hours. Is that right?
6 to 7 hours.
6 to 7 hours.
Yeah.
And do we know where he was going or why he was going there?
We don't. You know, we don't. We can speculate. It is everyone's best guess, and there are some that dispute it for various reasons, but for the most part, it's pretty settled that the aircraft turned south and ended somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean.
It's an amazing thing to imagine what was going on in that cockpit and what was going on in the cabin as passengers realized that the course has changed and they're just flying into the darkness and not reaching their destination. Like approach 146 Tango Charlie requesting change.
And number 6 Tango Charlie, squawk VFR, please change route.
Squawking VFR 146 Tango Charlie, thank you and good day. That thank you and good day reminded me of the last call that the MH370 pilot had with Malaysian air controllers, which was thank you and good night.
Thank you, good night. And as we were talking earlier about psychologists, we were talking about trying to get into the head of the potential perpetrator, whomever that might be.
Because if you get into the head of the perpetrator, it might help you understand where he actually took the plane.
That's right, because so much of the conjecture was around what happened at the end of flight, what we would call the end of flight scenarios. And the two primary scenarios were that the perpetrator had ended their life before the aircraft crashed into the ocean. But the other possibility was that, in fact, the perpetrator remained at the controls right until the end of flight, and rather than allowing the aircraft to crash uncontrolled into the water, took the controls, landed the aircraft, much like Captain Sullenberger did on the Hudson. And what that would potentially do is change where the aircraft ended, and it would also limit the amount of debris and make it a whole lot harder for anyone who was looking for it to find it.
Because he would just glide it down, put the aircraft down, and it would slowly sink and not fall apart.
Yeah.
In a crash,
absolutely.
In a fear crash.
So there is, if that scenario is true, and I am not entirely convinced, but I'm not entirely unconvinced either, that means that the aircraft could be in 1 or 2, maybe 3 pieces. So there might be a couple big pieces, but the fuselage will probably be mostly intact. And that seems to jive a little bit with what debris we found. There was some debris found from within the cabin, but not much. primarily the debris was found off the wings and the other sort of peripheral parts of the aircraft.
And the debris was found on the east coast of Africa.
East coast of Africa and on some of the islands off Aden. What's interesting is that they used oceanic drift modeling to try and determine where it might have entered the water. So then the search area changed. This was after I left the search, but the search area then changed based on this ocean drift analysis and a best guess as to where, if you sort of throw something in the water and see where it goes. That's, in a sense, what drift analysis is. It's a pretty complex science, actually. And I'm not entirely convinced that the ocean drift analysis is foolproof, and I would like to see someone else that doesn't do ocean drift analysis, because obviously they're not going to question their own science. Look at it. Someone with some expertise in another similar field to look to see whether this is a valid analysis, because I'm not entirely convinced it is, and I realise that my reasons for that are a bit anecdotal, but I spent a lot of time at sea, about 6 years of my career at least at sea, and I can tell you that when you throw something in the water, your chances of finding it are not always that good.
Right.
Even if you've only left it in the water for a couple of minutes, less than that even in some instances. The ocean is a very dynamic, unpredictable and non-linear environment.
I see.
And
so these models that experts were relying on aren't necessarily without their uncertainties. Earlier you were saying that it would have helped your search if it was more closely tied with the actual investigation. Because the Malaysian government is conducting the investigation into the pilot, the co-pilot, possible motives, and
the passengers as well.
The what?
Passengers as well.
The passengers as well. And at the same time that they're doing that, you're actually in the Indian Ocean trying to find the wreckage based on speculation that that's where the plane may have gone.
We were strategizing where the aircraft could be based on the data that we had. At the same time, they were investigating who may have done it and how. And you would sort of tend to think, at least in my books, that the two were symbiotic. Needed to be in better communication. There was some communication, but I was never convinced, and I was not the one communicating, but others were, but I was never convinced that we were being given the full story. And I don't think that's because there's some grand conspiracy. I just think because there were reputations on the line and people didn't want to be embarrassed. Countries didn't want to be embarrassed. Governments didn't want to be embarrassed.
And so what are the lessons you draw from this experience?
You know, I think the main lesson that I've drawn is one around how we solve complex problems. That sounds quite high level, I guess, but really what I mean by that is that the initial search effort was entirely unprecedented. It was as I said before, we had 30 days to find the black box before the battery ran out, so it was time critical. It was multi-agency. It was multinational. And the way that all came together, and I was an outside observer of it at that stage, but certainly spoke to people that were heavily involved at that point. The way that all came together was government working at its best, our institutions at their finest, people improvising on the spot when they didn't have the full picture, doing their best, working long hours, working hard. There was a really good sense of esprit de corps. What happened over time, though, as the search slowed down, we defined a rather large 120,000 square kilometre search area, and a bureaucratic network, a web of bureaucracy really wrapped itself around the search effort and then made it difficult for those conducting the search to change things when they needed to change, to re-question and re-examine some of the fundamental assumptions about the search, like some of the ones I've mentioned already. Was the pilot at the controls at the end? Was the perpetrator at the controls at the end? Those questions became really difficult to answer once that bureaucratic web wrapped itself around the search effort. So I was quite enthused by it at first, but I think once I realised that that we had almost locked ourselves into searching for these. When we defined the search area, it became very difficult for us to then go off script. We were locked into that 120,000 square kilometres, whereas actually it became pretty obvious before that area was finished that it was probably unlikely to be there.
And yet you continued?
And yet we continued.
Wow. And why was that? Because the leadership didn't want to be embarrassed?
Yeah, because the leadership didn't want to be embarrassed because there were sensitivities with our relationship with Malaysia and China, and that was very frustrating. When I left the search in September of 2015, after being there for a year, I remember this very, very clearly. I spoke to my brother the day I left, and I said, they're not going to find it. Guarantee you they won't find it. Then,
so they really need to do the search again with a different
they need
structure.
to go back to first principles, and anyone that's been involved before needs to not be involved again. And that's not just the people in Australia, that's not the search officials, independent group, this group of mostly retired engineers and data scientists online. There's a whole online community around this. They need to stop being involved. And some fresh eyes and some fresh perspectives. And if work, it's that you need to get the right people in the room.
Right.
And ask the right questions. And sometimes you don't know what the right questions are if you don't have the right people in the room. But if everyone looks the same, everyone has the same background, then why should anyone be surprised when you come up with the same answer? And that is exactly what happened with MH370.